Hi guys, welcome to another deep dive into the shadows of history, where we peel back the layers of time to reveal stories that are as fascinating as they are unsettling. Tonight, we're journeying back to the 16th century, to the heart of Tudor England, where one of the most powerful monarchs in history met an end that was as grotesque as it was tragic. We're talking about Henry VIII, the king who changed the course of English history, who broke with Rome, who married 6 times, and whose final years were marked by pain, paranoia, and a physical deterioration so severe that it still captures our imagination today. This isn't just a story about a king who passed away in his bed surrounded by courtiers. This is a story about how power, excess, and the human body can collide in the most unexpected and disturbing ways. We'll explore not just the moment of his passing, but the years of decline that led to it, the medical mysteries that plagued him, and the bizarre circumstances that surrounded his final hours. So, if you're ready to step back in time and witness the slow, painful unraveling of one of history's most larger-than-life figures, then you're in the right place. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. To understand the end of Henry VIII, we must first understand the beginning. Born on June 28, 1491, at Greenwich Palace, Henry was not supposed to be king. He was the second son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, and in the grand scheme of Tudor succession, he was the spare, not the heir. His older brother, Arthur, was groomed from birth to wear the crown, educated in the arts of kingship, and married at a young age to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess who brought with her a powerful alliance. Young Henry, meanwhile, was given a different education. He was trained in theology, in music, in the arts of war and sport. He learned to joust, to hunt, to dance, and to debate. He was a Renaissance prince in every sense, embodied with the vigor and enthusiasm of youth. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. In 1502, when Henry was just 10 years old, his brother Arthur passed away suddenly, likely from a mysterious sweating sickness that plagued England during that era. With Arthur's death, everything changed for young Henry. He was now the heir to the throne, the future of the Tudor dynasty resting on his broad shoulders. Henry VII, ever the cautious and calculating monarch, immediately moved to secure the Spanish alliance by betrothing young Henry to his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. This was a controversial move, as marrying one's brother's widow was generally forbidden by the Church. But a papal dispensation was obtained, and the betrothal was set. For the next 7 years, Henry lived in a strange limbo, neither fully prince nor fully king-in-waiting, while his father tightened his grip on the realm and the treasury. Henry VII was a miser, a man who had won his crown on the battlefield at Bosworth and who never forgot the precariousness of power. He hoarded gold, controlled his nobles with an iron fist, and kept young Henry on a very short leash. The prince was not allowed to exercise freely, not allowed to joust or engage in the dangerous sports he loved, and was kept under constant supervision. It must have been a frustrating time for a young man of Henry's temperament, full of energy and ambition, yet constrained by a father who saw danger in every shadow. Everything changed on April 21st, 1509, when Henry VII passed away and young Henry ascended to the throne as Henry VIII. He was just 17 years old, tall, handsome, athletic, and bursting with confidence. Contemporary accounts describe him as a golden prince with reddish gold hair, fair skin, and a physique that was the envy of his court. He stood over 6 feet tall in an age when the average man was considerably shorter, and he excelled at every physical pursuit. He could joust for hours, hunt all day, dance all night, and still have energy to compose music or debate theology with the scholars of his court. Venetian ambassadors who visited his court sent back glowing reports to their superiors, describing the young king as the handsomest potentate they had ever seen, with an extremely fine calf to his leg and a round face so very beautiful that it would become a pretty woman. These descriptions, while perhaps exaggerated by diplomatic flattery, give us a sense of how Henry appeared in his youth, a picture of vitality and masculine beauty that stood in stark contrast to the bloated, diseased figure he would become in his later years. Henry's athletic prowess was not just for show. It was central to his identity as a Renaissance prince and warrior king. He competed regularly in the tilt yard, the jousting arena, where he faced off against the best knights of his court in elaborate tournaments that combined martial skill with theatrical spectacle. Jousting was an extremely dangerous sport. Knights charged at each other at full gallop, separated by a wooden barrier called the tilt, each attempting to strike the other with a lance while traveling at speeds of up to 30 miles per hour. A successful hit could shatter a lance, knock a knight from his horse, or in the worst cases, cause serious injury or even fatality. Henry loved the danger and the glory of the joust, and he was genuinely skilled at it. He had special armor made, magnificent suits of plate armor decorated with gold and silver that can still be seen in the Tower of London today. These suits of armor tell the story of Henry's physical transformation. The early suits, from the 1510s and 1520s, show a tall, athletic man with a 32-inch waist and broad shoulders, while the later suits, from the 1540s, show a man with a 54-inch waist and massive girth. Hunting was another passion, and Henry pursued it with the same intensity he brought to everything else. He maintained vast hunting parks around London and would often ride for hours in pursuit of deer, boar, or other game. Hunting was not just sport. It was also a political activity, a way for the king to bond with his nobles, to reward favorites with the honor of joining the royal hunt, and to demonstrate his vigor and martial prowess. Henry was also an accomplished dancer, at a time when dancing was a serious social skill that required practice and grace. Court dances were elaborate, choreographed affairs, and the king was expected to lead by example. Henry could dance for hours at the masques and entertainments that were a regular feature of his court, and he clearly enjoyed the opportunity to display his grace and stamina. Music was yet another of his talents. He played several instruments, including the lute and the virginals, a type of keyboard instrument, and he composed songs and instrumental pieces, some of which survive to this day. The famous song Greensleeves is often attributed to Henry, though this attribution is probably false, but it speaks to his reputation as a composer that such a connection would be made. Within weeks of his accession, Henry married Catherine of Aragon, fulfilling his father's dying wish and cementing the Spanish alliance. The wedding was a grand affair, and the young couple seemed genuinely fond of each other. Catherine was older than Henry, having been born in 1485, but she was intelligent, devout, and dignified, and she brought a sense of stability to the young king's court. The early years of Henry's reign were marked by extravagance and display. He was determined to be the opposite of his father in every way. Where Henry VII had been miserly, Henry VIII would be generous. Where the old king had been cautious, the young king would be bold. Henry VIII threw lavish tournaments, hosted elaborate masques, and spent money with a freedom that would have horrified his father. The court became a center of Renaissance culture, attracting scholars, artists, and musicians from across Europe. Thomas More, who would later serve as Lord Chancellor and would eventually be executed for refusing to accept Henry's break with Rome, was a close friend and intellectual companion in these early years. Erasmus of Rotterdam, the great humanist scholar, visited England multiple times and dedicated works to Henry, praising his learning and wisdom. The Venetian ambassador reported that Henry's court was the most splendid in Christendom, surpassing even the courts of France and the Holy Roman Empire in magnificence and cultural sophistication. The tournaments that Henry organized were spectacular affairs that could last for days. They were not just athletic competitions, but elaborate theatrical productions with costumes, pageantry, and allegorical themes. Knights would enter the lists dressed as characters from romance literature, or as exotic figures like Turks or wild men of the woods. There would be barriers, foot combats where armored knights would fight with swords and axes over a waist-high barrier, and melees, mock battles involving multiple participants. These events were hugely expensive, requiring the construction of elaborate temporary structures, the manufacture of special armor and weapons, the hiring of heralds and musicians, and the provision of prizes and banquets. But Henry saw them as essential to his image as a chivalric king, and he spared no expense. Foreign ambassadors were always invited to these tournaments, and they would report back to their rulers about the magnificence of the English court and the prowess of the English king. Henry's relationship with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was genuinely affectionate in these early years. Catherine was intelligent, well-educated, and politically astute. She had been raised in Spain as the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the monarchs who had completed the Reconquista and expelled the Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula, and who had sponsored Christopher Columbus's voyage to the Americas. Catherine brought with her a deep Catholic piety, a strong sense of royal dignity, and considerable political experience. During Henry's military campaign in France in 1513, Catherine served as regent of England, and when Scotland, taking advantage of Henry's absence, invaded England, it was Catherine who organized the English response. The Scottish king, James IV, was defeated and killed at the Battle of Flodden, one of the most decisive English victories over Scotland in history, and Catherine sent the Scottish king's bloodied coat to Henry in France as a trophy. This demonstrated that Catherine was not just a decorative consort, but a capable ruler in her own right. He surrounded himself with young men of similar temperament, and together they created a court that was the envy of Europe. But beneath the glittering surface, there were already signs of the character traits that would define his later reign. But Henry was vain, easily flattered, and deeply concerned with his own glory. He was also intelligent and well-educated, but he had an absolutist streak that would grow stronger with age. He believed deeply in the divine right of kings, in his own special relationship with God, and in his duty to produce a male heir to continue the Tudor line. This last concern would come to dominate his life and ultimately reshape England itself. Catherine of Aragon bore Henry several children, but only one survived infancy, a daughter named Mary, born in 1516. The tragedy of infant mortality was a constant presence in Henry and Catherine's marriage. Catherine became pregnant at least 6 times between 1510 and 1518. Their first child, a daughter, was stillborn in January 1510, less than a year after their marriage. Catherine became pregnant again almost immediately, and in January 1511 she gave birth to a son who was named Henry after his father. The birth of a male heir was greeted with enormous celebrations. Bonfires were lit across London, bells rang out from every church, and Henry organized a magnificent tournament to celebrate. But the joy was short-lived. The infant prince died after just 52 days of life. The cause of his passing is unknown, but infant mortality was tragically common in the 16th century, even in royal families with access to the best medical care available. Catherine was devastated by the loss, but determined to provide Henry with the heir he needed. She became pregnant again in 1513 and gave birth to a son who lived only a few hours. Another son was born prematurely in November 1514 and died shortly after birth. In February 1516, Catherine finally gave birth to a healthy child, but it was a daughter, not the longed-for son. This daughter was named Mary, and she would eventually become Queen Mary I. Henry was disappointed that the child was not male, but he was relieved that Catherine had at least proven she could bear a healthy child, and he believed that sons would follow. In November 1518, Catherine gave birth to another daughter who lived only a few hours. After this, there were no more pregnancies. By the early 1520s, Catherine was in her late 30s, considered old for childbearing by the standards of the time, and it became increasingly clear that she was unlikely to have any more children. The royal succession rested on a single life, that of Princess Mary, and this was a terrifying prospect for Henry and for England. The problem of succession was not just personal vanity or dynastic pride. England had only recently emerged from the Wars of the Roses, a series of civil wars between the houses of Lancaster and York that had torn the country apart for 3 decades. Henry's own father had won the throne on the battlefield, and the Tudor claim to the crown was not unquestioned. There were other descendants of the Plantagenet kings still alive, people who might press their own claims if Henry died without a clear heir. Moreover, there was no precedent for a woman ruling England in her own right. There had been an attempt in the 12th century when Matilda, daughter of Henry I, had tried to claim the throne, but it had resulted in a civil war, and Matilda had never been fully accepted as queen. The conventional wisdom was that a woman could not rule effectively, that she would be dominated by her husband if she married, or vulnerable to foreign conquest if she remained single. So when Henry looked at his daughter Mary and tried to imagine her as his successor, he saw not security but danger, the possibility of disputed succession, civil war, and the end of the Tudor dynasty. This fear was not irrational. It was based on a clear-eyed assessment of the political realities of his time. Henry was desperate for a son, for a male heir who could secure the succession and prevent the kind of dynastic warfare that had torn England apart during the Wars of the Roses. As the years passed and no son appeared, Henry's frustration grew. He began to see his lack of a male heir as a sign of divine displeasure, a punishment for having married his brother's widow. The theological arguments that had once seemed so convincing when the marriage was arranged now appeared deeply problematic to the king. He convinced himself that the marriage was invalid, that he had been living in sin for nearly 20 years, and that God was punishing him by denying him a son. This conviction would set in motion a chain of events that would change the course of English history. By the mid-1520s, Henry had fallen deeply in love with a young woman named Anne Boleyn. Anne was not a conventional beauty by the standards of the time. She was dark-haired and dark-eyed in an age that prized fair coloring, and she had spent much of her youth at the French court, where she had acquired a sophistication and polish that set her apart from other English ladies. She was probably born around 1501 or 1501, making her about 10 years younger than Henry. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was an ambitious diplomat and courtier who had served Henry in various capacities, and Anne had been sent to the Burgundian court and then to France as a young girl to complete her education. She spent about 7 years in France, serving first as maid of honor to the Archduchess Margaret of Austria, and then as a member of the household of Queen Claude of France. In France, she absorbed the sophisticated culture of the French court, learning to speak French fluently, to dance in the French style, and to dress with the elegance for which French noblewomen were famous. Anne returned to England around 1521 or 1522 and quickly made an impression at Henry's court. She was witty, charming, and cultured, with a sharpness and independence that was unusual for women of her class. She played the lute and sang well. She could engage in intelligent conversation about literature and theology, and she had a sense of style that influenced fashion at court. But what really set her apart was her personality. She was not willing to simply be another courtly lady, passive and decorative. She had opinions, she expressed them, and she was not afraid to challenge or tease even powerful men. This combination of intelligence, wit, and independence caught Henry's attention sometime around 1526. At first, he probably just saw her as a potential mistress, as he had taken mistresses before, including Anne's own sister, Mary Boleyn. But Anne refused to become his mistress. When Henry sent her gifts and letters, she returned them or responded coolly. She made it clear that if Henry wanted her, he would have to marry her, and she would accept nothing less than being queen. More importantly, she refused to become Henry's mistress, as her sister Mary had been. Anne insisted that if Henry wanted her, he would have to marry her, and this refusal only inflamed Henry's passion. He became obsessed with the idea of marrying Anne, and this obsession combined with his genuine concerns about the succession to create an unstoppable force. Henry began to pressure the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine, arguing that the original papal dispensation had been invalid and that he had never been truly married in the eyes of God. What followed was one of the most dramatic political and religious crises of the 16th century. The Pope, caught between Henry's demands and the political power of Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, refused to grant the annulment. The situation was incredibly complex from the Pope's perspective. On one hand, there were legitimate theological questions about whether the original dispensation allowing Henry to marry his brother's widow had been valid. The Bible contains passages that could be interpreted as forbidding such marriages, particularly in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 21, which states that if a man takes his brother's wife, it is an impurity, and they shall be childless. Henry seized on this passage as proof that his marriage had been cursed by God, though conveniently ignoring the fact that he had a daughter, so he was not strictly childless. On the other hand, the Pope had already granted a dispensation for the marriage, and to declare that dispensation invalid would be to admit that the papal authority could make mistakes, which would undermine the entire basis of papal power. Moreover, Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was the most powerful ruler in Europe and who had political control over much of Italy, including the city of Rome itself. In fact, Charles's troops had sacked Rome in 1527, just as Henry was beginning his campaign for an annulment, and the Pope was effectively a prisoner of imperial power. Under these circumstances, granting Henry's request would have been politically suicidal for the Pope. Henry's chief minister, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, failed to secure the annulment despite years of effort, and in 1529 he fell from power, dying on his way to face charges of treason. Wolsey had been Henry's most trusted advisor for nearly 2 decades, managing both domestic policy and foreign affairs with considerable skill. He had risen from relatively humble origins, the son of an Ipswich butcher, to become Archbishop of York, Cardinal, and Lord Chancellor of England, the highest offices in church and state. He lived in magnificent style at Hampton Court Palace, which he had built and which was more splendid than any of the king's own residences, a fact that would later be held against him. Wolsey had genuinely tried to secure Henry's annulment, sending envoys to Rome, pressuring the Pope through diplomatic channels, and even arranging for a special papal court to meet in England to hear the case. This court, presided over by Cardinal Campeggio, met at Blackfriars in London in 1529, and Catherine of Aragon appeared before it to make her case. In a dramatic scene, she knelt before Henry and pleaded with him to remember their 20 years of marriage, to consider their daughter, and to acknowledge that she had come to him as a virgin and that her marriage to his brother Arthur had never been consummated. It was a powerful moment, and it won Catherine considerable public sympathy, but it did not change Henry's mind. When Campeggio, under instructions from Rome, adjourned the court without reaching a verdict and declared that the case would have to be heard in Rome, Wolsey's fate was sealed. Henry blamed him for the failure to secure the annulment and stripped him of the office of Lord Chancellor. Wolsey was arrested in November 1530 on charges of treason and began the journey south to London to face trial. He never completed the journey. He fell ill at Leicester Abbey and passed away there on November 29, 1530. His last words were reportedly a warning to his servant Thomas Cromwell about the dangers of serving Henry, saying, "If I had served God as diligently as I have done the king, he would not have given me over in my gray hairs." It was a poignant epitaph for a man who had devoted his life to serving his king, and who had ultimately been destroyed when he could not deliver what the king demanded. Henry, frustrated and increasingly desperate, began to listen to more radical voices. Men like Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer suggested a revolutionary solution. If the Pope would not grant Henry what he wanted, then perhaps Henry should break with Rome entirely. Over the next few years, that's exactly what happened. Through a series of parliamentary acts, Henry declared himself supreme head of the Church in England, severed ties with Rome, dissolved the monasteries and confiscated their wealth, and fundamentally transformed the religious landscape of his kingdom. In 1533, after secretly marrying Anne Boleyn, Henry had his new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, officially annul his marriage to Catherine. Catherine was banished from court, her daughter Mary was declared illegitimate, and Anne was crowned queen. But the story of Anne Boleyn would prove to be tragically short. She gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, in September 1533, but Henry was disappointed that the child was not a son. Anne suffered several miscarriages in the following years, including a devastating loss in January 1536, when she miscarried what may have been a male child. By this time, Henry's passion for Anne had cooled considerably. She was sharp-tongued, quick-tempered, and unafraid to challenge the king, qualities that had attracted him when she was unattainable, but that irritated him now that she was his wife. Henry's eye had already begun to wander, and he had fixed his attention on Jane Seymour, one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting. Jane was everything Anne was not: quiet, submissive, and conventional. Thomas Cromwell, always alert to the changing winds of royal favor, saw an opportunity. In May 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested on charges of adultery, treason, and even incest with her own brother. The charges were almost certainly false, manufactured by Cromwell to give Henry what he wanted, but the result was predetermined. Anne was tried, convicted, and on May 19, 1536, she was executed by a French swordsman brought specially from Calais. Just 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour finally gave Henry what he desperately wanted: a legitimate male heir. On October 12, 1537, she gave birth to a son, who was named Edward. Henry was overjoyed, and the entire country celebrated. But the celebration was short-lived. Jane developed childbed fever, a common and often fatal complication of childbirth in that era, and despite the best efforts of the royal physicians, she passed away on October 24th, less than 2 weeks after giving birth. Henry was genuinely grief-stricken by Jane's passing. Of all his wives, she would be the one he remembered most fondly, probably because she had given him his son and had passed away before the relationship had time to sour. He would eventually be buried beside her at Windsor Castle. But even in his grief, the machinery of statecraft continued to turn. England needed alliances, and the king needed a wife. Thomas Cromwell, now Henry's chief minister, began looking for a suitable foreign princess who could cement an alliance with one of the Protestant powers of Northern Europe. Cromwell's choice fell on Anne of Cleves, sister of the Duke of Cleves, a strategic territory in the complex political landscape of the Holy Roman Empire. Cromwell arranged for Hans Holbein, the court painter, to travel to Cleves and paint Anne's portrait. Holbein was a master of his craft, and his portrait of Anne showed an attractive young woman with a serene expression. Based on this portrait and Cromwell's glowing reports, Henry agreed to the marriage. But when Anne arrived in England in late December 1539, Henry was horrified. Whether Anne really was unattractive, or whether Henry's expectations had simply been built up too high, is a matter of historical debate. But Henry took one look at his bride-to-be and is reported to have called her a Flanders mare. Despite his revulsion, the political situation required that the marriage go forward, and on January 6, 1540, Henry and Anne were married. The marriage was a disaster from the start. Henry found Anne physically repulsive and could not bring himself to consummate the marriage. By July, just 6 months after the wedding, Henry was looking for a way out. Anne, pragmatic and intelligent, agreed to an annulment, claiming that the marriage had never been consummated. In return, Henry settled a generous income on her, gave her several properties, and treated her as the king's beloved sister for the rest of her life. She would outlive all of Henry's other wives and would live comfortably in England until her own passing in 1557. But Cromwell, who had arranged the disastrous marriage, was not so fortunate. Henry, always looking for someone to blame when things went wrong, turned on his faithful minister. Cromwell was arrested on charges of treason and heresy in June 1540 and executed in July of the same year. On the very day of Cromwell's execution, Henry married his fifth wife, Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard was young, vivacious, and pretty, a far cry from the solid and unattractive Anne of Cleves. She was a cousin of Anne Boleyn and came from the powerful Howard family, one of the leading noble houses in England. Henry, now in his late 40s and increasingly corpulent and unhealthy, was infatuated with his teenage bride. He called her his rose without a thorn and showered her with gifts and attention. But Catherine was young and foolish, and she had a past that she had not disclosed to the king. Before her marriage, she had been involved with several young men, including a music teacher and a gentleman of the court. Worse still, after her marriage to Henry, she apparently resumed a relationship with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber. In late 1541, rumors of Catherine's indiscretions reached the ears of Archbishop Cranmer, who reluctantly brought them to the king's attention. Henry was devastated. He had genuinely loved Catherine, or at least had been as close to love as a man of his temperament could get, and the revelation of her betrayal hit him hard. He wept openly when he was told the news, something that was almost unheard of for a Tudor monarch. Catherine was questioned, and under pressure, she confessed to her premarital affairs and may have confessed to adultery with Culpeper as well. The evidence is unclear, but in the climate of Henry's court, the distinction hardly mattered. Catherine Howard and Thomas Culpeper were both executed in February 1542. Catherine on the same scaffold where her cousin Anne Boleyn had perished less than 6 years earlier. After the trauma of the Catherine Howard affair, Henry waited several years before marrying again. When he did, in July 1543, he chose a very different kind of woman. Catherine Parr was a widow twice over, intelligent, well-educated, and deeply interested in religious reform. She was 31 years old, mature and sensible, and she had no illusions about the nature of the marriage. She knew she was marrying an aging, unhealthy king who needed a nurse as much as a wife, and she accepted the role with grace and competence. Catherine Parr was exactly what Henry needed in his final years. She was a good stepmother to his 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, bringing them together and creating something resembling a normal family life for them. She was a devoted nurse to Henry, managing his increasingly difficult moods and his painful medical conditions with patience and skill. She was also intelligent enough to avoid the mistakes that had cost Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard their lives. When religious conservatives at court tried to trap her by reporting her reformist religious views to the king, she skillfully deflected the danger by submitting to Henry's authority and appealing to his vanity. She would survive Henry and would outlive him by just over a year, dying in September 1548 from childbed fever after giving birth to a daughter by her fourth husband, Thomas Seymour. But let's return to Henry himself, because by the time he married Catherine Parr, he was already well into the physical decline that would characterize his final years. The Golden Prince of 1509 was long gone, replaced by a bloated, diseased, and increasingly paranoid tyrant. The transformation had been gradual but inexorable, and it had been caused by a combination of factors, some of which were under Henry's control, and some of which were simply the result of bad luck and bad medicine. One of the key turning points in Henry's physical decline came in January 1536, just a few months before Anne Boleyn's execution. Henry was jousting at Greenwich Palace, one of his favorite pastimes, when his horse fell on him. Henry was thrown to the ground with tremendous force, and his armored horse, weighing well over 1,000 pounds, landed on top of him. He was unconscious for 2 hours, and his courtiers feared he had been killed. When he finally regained consciousness, he seemed to have escaped serious injury, but the accident may have had lasting consequences that were not immediately apparent. The circumstances of the accident are worth examining in detail because they help us understand the physical and psychological impact it had on Henry. At 44 years old, he was no longer the youthful athlete of his early reign, but he still took part in the demanding and risky sport of jousting. On January 24, 1536, Henry was competing in the lists at Greenwich, probably wearing one of his magnificent suits of jousting armor and riding a specially trained warhorse. Jousting horses were massive animals, bred for size and strength, capable of carrying a fully armored knight at a gallop. During the joust, something went wrong. Henry's horse stumbled or fell, perhaps striking one of its legs on the tilt barrier, perhaps simply losing its footing on the packed earth of the tilt yard. Henry, top-heavy in his armor and traveling at high speed, could not recover his balance or control his mount. He was thrown from the saddle, and the horse, unable to stop its momentum, fell on top of him. The combined weight of the horse and Henry's own armor, probably totaling close to 1,500 pounds, came crashing down on the king's body. Henry was knocked unconscious immediately. His attendants rushed to him, carefully removing his helmet and trying to revive him. For 2 hours he lay motionless, and everyone feared the worst. Anne Boleyn, who was 5 months pregnant at the time, was informed of the accident and was reportedly terrified that Henry had been killed. The stress of this news may have contributed to her miscarriage just 4 days later, when she lost what might have been a male child, a loss that would seal her fate. Some historians believe that the fall may have caused a traumatic brain injury that affected Henry's personality. In the years after the accident, he became noticeably more paranoid, more irrational, and more prone to violent mood swings. The charming, if egotistical young king gave way to a suspicious tyrant who saw threats everywhere and who was quick to send even his closest advisors to the scaffold. Whether this change was due to brain damage, to the cumulative stress of his marital troubles and religious reforms, or simply to the natural hardening of character that comes with age and absolute power, is impossible to say with certainty. But what is certain is that after 1536, Henry was a changed man. The other major consequence of the jousting accident was physical. Henry had always been active and athletic, but the fall seems to have exacerbated or perhaps caused chronic leg ulcers that would plague him for the rest of his life. These ulcers were likely varicose ulcers caused by poor circulation in his legs, and they became infected and extremely painful. In an age before antibiotics, there was no effective treatment for such infections, and the best the royal physicians could do was to keep the ulcers open and draining, believing that this would allow the bad humors to escape from the body. This treatment, based on the medical understanding of the time, was not only ineffective, but probably made the condition worse by preventing the wounds from healing. As the ulcers worsened, Henry found it increasingly difficult to exercise. The man who had once jousted for hours and hunted all day was now largely confined to his palaces, unable to walk more than short distances without pain. But his appetite remained undiminished. Henry had always been a hearty eater, but now, with no physical activity to burn off the calories, he began to gain weight at an alarming rate. We have detailed records of Henry's diet from his later years, and they give us a sense of the enormous quantities of food he consumed. A typical dinner at the royal court might include a dozen or more courses, starting with soups and broths, moving on to multiple meat dishes, including beef, mutton, pork, venison, and various types of poultry. Then fish dishes, then elaborate pies and pastries, and finally sweet dishes and desserts. Henry would not have eaten all of this himself. The food was served to the entire court and distributed according to strict protocols of rank and precedence. But as king, he had first choice of everything and could eat as much as he wanted of whatever he wanted. Contemporary accounts suggest that Henry had a particular fondness for meat, especially venison and wild boar from his hunting parks. He enjoyed elaborate meat pies, some of which were enormous constructions containing whole birds or joints of meat. He liked sweet wines and hippocras, a spiced wine that was popular in the Tudor period. He enjoyed marchpane, a sweet confection made from almonds and sugar and various kinds of preserved fruits. The Tudor diet, at least for the wealthy, was heavy in meat and fat, and relatively low in fresh vegetables and fruits, which were viewed with suspicion and considered unhealthy unless cooked. This diet, combined with Henry's lack of exercise, created the perfect conditions for obesity and metabolic disease. By the early 1540s, he had become obese. Contemporary accounts describe him as having a waist measurement of 54 inches, and he probably weighed close to 400 pounds. His armor, which still survives and can be measured, tells the story of his expanding girth. The slim, athletic young man of 1509 had become a mountain of a man, so large that he had to be moved around his palaces in specially constructed chairs that were carried by teams of strong servants. These chairs, called chairman's chairs or sedan chairs, were essentially portable thrones, enclosed boxes with a seat inside and poles extending from the sides so that 4 or more strong men could lift and carry them. Henry required these chairs because he could no longer manage stairs, and even walking on level ground had become extremely painful and exhausting. His palaces had to be modified to accommodate his size and limited mobility. Ramps were constructed to replace stairs where possible. A mechanical device, essentially a primitive elevator powered by a windlass and pulley system, was installed at Whitehall Palace to lift Henry between floors. Doorways had to be widened to allow his bulk to pass through. Chairs and beds had to be specially reinforced to support his weight. Regular furniture would simply collapse under him. Even mounting a horse for hunting, One of his last remaining pleasures became an elaborate production requiring a special mounting block and multiple attendants to help heave him into a reinforced saddle. The combination of obesity, infected leg ulcers, and advancing age created a vicious cycle of declining health. The obesity put more strain on his legs, worsening the ulcers and making it even harder to move. The lack of movement led to more weight gain, which put more strain on his circulatory system and likely contributed to high blood pressure and other cardiovascular problems. The constant pain from the ulcers made him irritable and difficult, and he may have self-medicated with alcohol, which would have added more empty calories to his diet and worsened his overall health. Beyond the leg ulcers and obesity, Henry suffered from a range of other health problems in his final years. He had chronic headaches, which may have been related to high blood pressure or to the possible brain injury from the jousting accident. He suffered from what was described as a strangury, difficulty and pain in urinating, which suggests prostate problems or possibly kidney stones. His physicians also noted that he suffered from what they called melancholy, periods of deep depression and mood swings that made him unpredictable and dangerous. Some modern medical historians have suggested that Henry may have suffered from type 2 diabetes, which would have been undiagnosed and untreated in the 16th century, but which would explain many of his symptoms, including the poor wound healing, the obesity, the mood swings, and the circulatory problems. Others have suggested that he may have had Cushing's syndrome, a disorder of the adrenal glands that causes obesity, mood changes, and poor wound healing. Still others have speculated about syphilis, though there is little solid evidence for this diagnosis, or about other conditions such as hypothyroidism or various metabolic disorders. What is certain is that by the mid-1540s, Henry was a very sick man. His once handsome face had become bloated and flushed, often red with what may have been rosacea or simply the effects of high blood pressure and excessive drinking. His legs were swollen and painful, constantly wrapped in bandages to absorb the drainage from the ulcers. His body was so large that normal furniture could not support him, and he required specially reinforced chairs and beds. He could not climb stairs and had to use a system of ramps and mechanical lifts to move between the floors of his palaces. Getting on and off his horse for hunting, one of his last remaining pleasures, required a complex system of pulleys and hoists. He was, in effect, a prisoner in his own enormous body, a once great athlete reduced to helplessness by disease and excess. Yet despite his physical limitations, Henry remained mentally sharp and politically active until very near the end. He continued to govern, to make decisions about foreign policy and domestic matters, and to manage the complex web of court politics. In 1544, he embarked on one last military adventure, leading an invasion of France that was more symbolic than effective, but that showed he still saw himself as a warrior king. The campaign was a strain on his health, but he saw it through, determined to recapture some of the glory of his youth. The final years of Henry's reign were marked by increasing paranoia and brutality. As his health declined, he became ever more suspicious of those around him, seeing plots and treasons everywhere. The atmosphere at court became poisonous, with courtiers constantly watching each other for signs of disloyalty, afraid that any word or gesture might be reported to the king and result in arrest and execution. The list of those who went to the scaffold in Henry's final years is staggering. It includes some of his closest friends and advisors, men who had served him faithfully for decades. In 1540, as we have seen, Thomas Cromwell was executed. Cromwell had been Henry's most capable minister, the architect of the break with Rome and the dissolution of the monasteries, a brilliant administrator who had transformed English government. But he had made the mistake of arranging Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, and when that marriage proved disastrous, Cromwell became the scapegoat. He was arrested in June 1540 during a council meeting at Westminster, dramatically seized by members of the nobility who had long resented his power and low birth. He was accused of treason and heresy, charges that were largely fabricated, and was executed on July 28, 1540, the same day that Henry married Catherine Howard. Cromwell's execution was particularly brutal. The executioner was inexperienced or drunk, and it took multiple blows of the axe to sever his head, a prolonged agony that horrified the watching crowd. In 1541, Margaret Pole, the elderly Countess of Salisbury and the last of the Plantagenets, was executed after a brutal imprisonment, her crime being nothing more than her royal blood and the fact that her son was in exile opposing Henry's religious policies. Margaret Pole was 67 years old when she was executed, a frail elderly woman who had once served as governess to Princess Mary and who had always conducted herself with dignity and grace. She was arrested in November 1538, not because she had done anything treasonous, but because her son, Cardinal Reginald Pole, was in Europe writing and preaching against Henry's religious policies and calling for a Catholic crusade against England. Henry could not reach Reginald, so he struck at his family instead. Margaret was imprisoned in the Tower of London under harsh conditions, deprived of adequate clothing and heating, left to suffer in the cold damp of her cell. She was finally executed on May 27, 1541, and the execution was botched. According to some accounts, she refused to lay her head on the block, saying she was no traitor, and the executioner had to chase her around the scaffold, hacking at her with the axe until she finally died. This story may be exaggerated, but it reflects the horror that people felt at the execution of such an obviously innocent victim. In 1542, Catherine Howard and Thomas Culpeper were executed, as we have already discussed. In 1546, just months before Henry's own passing, Anne Askew, a Protestant reformer, was tortured and burned at the stake. Anne Askew was a young gentlewoman from Lincolnshire who had left her husband because of religious differences and had come to London, where she became involved in Protestant circles. She was arrested for heresy, for denying the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, the belief that the bread and wine of communion literally become the body and blood of Christ. She was interrogated repeatedly, and when she refused to recant her beliefs or to name other Protestants, she was tortured on the rack in the Tower of London. The use of torture on a woman was highly unusual. English law generally prohibited torturing women, and the fact that it was authorized in Anne's case shows how desperate the conservative faction at court was to implicate high-ranking Protestants, possibly even Queen Catherine Parr. Anne was racked so severely that her bones were dislocated and she could not walk. She had to be carried to her execution in a chair. She was burned at Smithfield on July 16, 1546, along with 3 other Protestant martyrs. Throughout her ordeal, she maintained her faith and refused to betray her friends, becoming a Protestant martyr whose story would be told and retold in the decades to come. Also in 1546, Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey and son of the Duke of Norfolk, was executed for treason. Surrey was a brilliant poet, one of the finest of his generation, and a proud nobleman who traced his ancestry back to the Plantagenet kings. His crime was quartering his coat of arms in a way that suggested he had royal pretensions, displaying the arms of Edward the Confessor, which were associated with the royal family. It was a flimsy charge, but Surrey had made enemies at court, and more importantly, his father, the Duke of Norfolk, was leader of the conservative Catholic faction that opposed the Protestant reformers who were gaining influence with the young Prince Edward. With Henry dying and a minority government approaching, the reformers wanted to eliminate their rivals, and Surrey became their target. He was tried and convicted of treason and executed on January 19, 1547, just 9 days before Henry's own passing. The Earl of Surrey's father, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, was also condemned to follow his son to the block, and was only saved by the fact that Henry passed away the night before the scheduled execution. This reign of terror in Henry's final years was partly the result of his deteriorating personality, but it was also driven by very real political concerns. Henry knew he was dying, and he was desperate to ensure a smooth succession for his son Edward, who was still just a child. He feared that if he passed away with Edward still a minor, there would be a power struggle between the various factions at court, between the religious conservatives and the reformers, between the old nobility and the new men who had risen through Henry's service. So he struck preemptively, removing anyone he saw as a potential threat to his son's future reign. In his own mind, he was being a good father and a good king, securing his son's inheritance. But the result was that his final years were drenched in blood, and his court was a place of fear where no one, no matter how high or how loyal, could feel safe. It's worth taking a moment to consider what Henry's daily life was like in these final years. He woke late, because sleeping was one of the few activities that didn't cause him pain, though even sleep was often interrupted by discomfort from his ulcers or difficulty breathing due to his weight. When he woke, attendants would enter his bedchamber, members of the Privy Chamber, a select group of gentlemen who had the privilege of attending to the king's most intimate needs. He was dressed by his gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, a process that took considerable time given his size and his mobility issues. Multiple people were required to help him from his bed, to support him while he was washed and dressed, to handle the heavy fabrics of his robes and the complex fastenings of his garments. The leg ulcers had to be cleaned and rebandaged daily, a painful and smelly process. The ulcers produced a constant discharge, a mixture of pus and blood that soaked through the bandages and produced a foul odor that permeated the room. The physicians would carefully unwrap the old bandages, clean the wounds with various solutions, apply fresh poultices, and wrap them again with clean linen. Henry would have to endure this process stoically, maintaining the dignity of kingship even while his body was being tended to in the most undignified ways. After being dressed, Henry would attend to business. He would receive reports from his ministers, read correspondence from foreign ambassadors, review petitions from his subjects, and sign documents. Despite his physical infirmities, he still had a sharp mind for policy, and he kept a close eye on everything from foreign affairs to the details of his household accounts. He would meet with his council, a group of advisors who helped him govern the realm, discussing matters of state, making decisions about appointments and promotions, and reviewing legal cases. These meetings might last for several hours, and they required Henry to sit upright and maintain concentration despite his pain and discomfort. He still insisted on being informed about every significant decision, and ministers who tried to act without his approval could expect a furious rebuke or worse. He continued to take an active interest in military matters, despite not having personally commanded troops in the field since his 1544 campaign in France. He reviewed reports from the border with Scotland, where sporadic warfare continued, and from the coastal fortifications that had been built to defend against possible French or Spanish invasion. Meals were elaborate affairs, with dozens of courses, though by this point Henry probably couldn't eat as much as he once had. The decline in his appetite was noted by his physicians and courtiers as a sign of his worsening health. A formal dinner at the royal table was a highly ritualized event. Food would be brought in by a procession of servants. Each dish was tasted by an official called a sewer to ensure it wasn't poisoned, and everything was served with elaborate ceremony. Even if Henry ate little, the spectacle continued, because the magnificence of the royal table was part of the display of royal power. His physicians were constantly trying to regulate his diet, recommending certain foods and forbidding others, according to the humoral theory of medicine. They would prescribe light broths when they thought he had too much phlegm, or cooling foods when they thought he was too hot and choleric. But Henry often ignored their advice, eating what he wanted when he wanted it, one of the few pleasures remaining to him. After dinner, if the weather was good, he might be carried out to watch hunting, or he might sit in his gardens. The gardens at Hampton Court and his other palaces were elaborate and beautiful, laid out in the formal geometric style of Renaissance gardens, with fountains, topiary, and flower beds arranged in intricate patterns. Henry could sit in a chair in the shade and enjoy the fresh air and the sight of greenery, a welcome change from the stuffy interior of the palace. Music was a constant presence. Henry had always loved music and had been an accomplished composer and performer in his youth, and now he found comfort in listening to his musicians play. The royal household employed dozens of musicians, including singers for the chapel royal, instrumentalists who played at mealtimes and entertainments, and specialist performers who could play the latest compositions from the continent. Music would accompany meals, would be performed during evening entertainments, and might be played softly in the background while Henry worked or rested. He would receive visitors, both English courtiers and foreign ambassadors, all of whom had to pretend not to notice the king's deteriorating condition, the smell from his ulcers, the labored breathing, the obvious pain he was in. Ambassadors would write home describing Henry's illness in coded terms, trying to assess how much longer he might live, because this information was crucial to their country's diplomatic planning. But in the king's presence, everyone maintained the fiction that he was still the mighty monarch, still the man in control, still commanding and vigorous. He would play cards or dice, games he had always enjoyed, though now he played sitting down rather than standing, and the games were brief because his concentration flagged. He was fond of Primero, a card game that was a precursor to modern poker, and he would play for high stakes, though everyone knew to let the king win unless he was in a particularly good mood. And through it all, he maintained the fiction that he was still the same Henry, still the king who commanded respect and fear, still the supreme authority in his realm. But everyone could see that this was a fiction, that the king was dying by inches, that each month he was weaker than the month before, that the end was approaching. The question on everyone's mind was not if the king would die, but when, and what would happen afterwards. Would Prince Edward's succession be smooth, or would there be challenges? Would the reformers or the conservatives gain control of the minority government? Would England maintain its uneasy religious settlement, or would there be further dramatic changes? These questions could not be discussed openly, because to speculate about the king's passing was treason, but they were on everyone's minds, and courtiers maneuvered constantly to position themselves for advantage in the coming new reign. By late 1546, even this reduced routine was becoming difficult. Henry was now confined to just a few rooms in his palaces, unable to move without assistance. The ulcers on his legs had become so bad that they were now described as fistulas, deep channels in the flesh that went down to the bone. A fistula is an abnormal connection between two body parts, and in Henry's case, these were probably tunnels through the infected tissue of his legs, constantly draining foul-smelling pus and preventing any possibility of healing. The pain must have been excruciating, a constant burning, throbbing agony that never ceased. Modern medical understanding tells us that chronic pain of this severity can cause profound changes in the nervous system, making the sufferer hypersensitive to all stimuli and contributing to anxiety, depression, and personality changes. Henry was almost certainly being given opium-based pain medications, which would have made him drowsy and confused. Opium was one of the few effective painkillers available in the 16th century, derived from poppy plants and administered in various forms, including tinctures and pills. It would have provided some relief from the pain, but it also would have had significant side effects, including constipation, which would have added to Henry's discomfort, drowsiness, confusion, and potentially addiction. The balance between giving enough opium to control the pain and not giving so much that the king became completely stupefied would have been difficult to manage, and the physicians probably struggled with this throughout Henry's final months. He suffered from what were described as fits, possibly small strokes or seizures, which left him temporarily unable to speak or move. These episodes would have been terrifying for Henry and for those around him. One moment he would be functioning normally, perhaps dictating a letter or listening to a report, and the next he would be struck down, perhaps falling unconscious, perhaps remaining conscious but unable to move or speak, his face perhaps drooping on one side, his speech perhaps slurred. These fits suggest that Henry was suffering from cerebrovascular disease, problems with the blood vessels supplying his brain. This is not surprising given his obesity, his probable high blood pressure, his lack of exercise, and his age. Each small stroke would have caused some damage to his brain, killing neurons and potentially affecting his cognitive function, his emotional regulation, and his physical abilities. The cumulative effect of multiple strokes would have been a gradual deterioration in function, which is exactly what we see in the historical record of Henry's final year. He was also suffering from what the physicians called a fever, probably a recurrent infection related to the leg ulcers. Fever in Tudor medicine was understood very differently than we understand it today. Any condition that involved heat, inflammation, or increased temperature might be called a fever, and physicians would prescribe treatments intended to cool the patient and balance the humors. In reality, Henry was probably suffering from repeated bacterial infections of his ulcers, with the bacteria entering his bloodstream and causing sepsis. Without antibacteria, there was no way to cure such infections. The body's immune system either fought them off or it didn't. An otherwise healthy person might recover from such an infection, but Henry's immune system was compromised by his obesity, his diabetes if he had it, his age, and his overall poor health. Each infection would weaken him further, making the next infection more difficult to fight off. Despite all this, he continued to work when he could, continuing to sign documents and make decisions almost to the very end. In December 1546, Henry made his final public appearance, receiving the French ambassador. By this point, he was so weak that he could barely speak, and the ambassador reported back to France that the English king was clearly dying. The ambassador's dispatch described Henry as swollen and bloated, barely able to move, speaking with difficulty, his face flushed, and his breathing labored. It was clear to anyone who saw him that the end was approaching. But Henry rallied somewhat after this, and through December and into January 1547, he seemed to stabilize. This is not uncommon in terminal illness. Patients often experience what is called a terminal rally or surge, a brief period of improved energy and clarity before the final decline. Henry used this period to make plans for the future, discussing arrangements for his son's minority government, ensuring that his will was in order, and continuing to dispose of his enemies, as we saw with the execution of the Earl of Surrey. He also spent time with his children during this period. Prince Edward, now 9 years old, was brought to court to spend time with his father. The two princesses, Mary and Elizabeth, were also present for at least part of this time. Henry had been an inconsistent father, sometimes doting and affectionate, sometimes coldly distant or actively hostile, but now, facing death, he seems to have wanted to see his children and to ensure that they understood what was expected of them. Henry's will, which he finalized in these last weeks, was a crucial document that would shape English politics for years to come. In it, he confirmed the succession as Edward, then Mary, then Elizabeth, overriding his previous declarations that both Mary and Elizabeth were illegitimate. This was a pragmatic decision. Henry wanted to ensure that the Tudor line continued, and he was willing to overlook questions of legitimacy to achieve this. He also appointed a regency council to govern during Edward's minority, carefully balancing reformers and conservatives to try to prevent any one faction from dominating. He excluded some powerful figures, most notably his brother-in-law Edward Seymour, the Earl of Hertford, from the most important positions, though Seymour would quickly outmaneuver the others and make himself Lord Protector after Henry's passing. The will also included provisions for masses to be said for Henry's soul, an interesting detail given that prayers for the dead were increasingly controversial in Protestant theology. This reflects Henry's religious conservatism. He had broken with Rome and dissolved the monasteries, but he still believed in purgatory and in the efficacy of prayers and masses for the souls of the departed. But in late January 1547, it became clear that the end was near. Henry's condition deteriorated rapidly. The fever worsened, and he became delirious, drifting in and out of consciousness. His legs had become so swollen and infected that they could barely be touched. He could no longer eat, and he could barely drink. His breathing became labored and rasping. The physicians knew there was nothing more they could do. In an age before modern medicine, once infection had taken hold to this degree, once the body had been weakened to this point, passing was inevitable. But there was a problem, a delicate political problem that none of Henry's courtiers wanted to address. Under the laws of England, It was treason to predict or discuss the king's passing while he was still alive. This law had been enacted to prevent speculation about the succession and to discourage plots against the king. But now, with Henry clearly dying, no one dared to tell him the truth, because to tell a king that he was dying could be interpreted as predicting his passing, which was a treasonable offense. So Henry's courtiers faced a terrible dilemma. They knew he needed to prepare his soul for what was coming, to make his final confession, to receive the last rites of the church. But no one wanted to be the one to tell him that he was dying, for fear of being accused of treason. Finally, on the evening of January 27, 1547, one of Henry's closest attendants, Sir Anthony Denny, summoned the courage to approach the dying king. Denny knelt by Henry's bed and gently told him that in man's judgment he was not like to live, and that he should prepare for what was to come. Remarkably, given Henry's reputation for rage, the king took this news calmly. Perhaps he had known all along. Perhaps the pain and weakness had already told him what his courtiers could not. He asked Denny what he should do, and Denny suggested that he send for Archbishop Cranmer so that he could receive spiritual comfort and make his final confession. Henry agreed, but he said he would sleep a little first, and then he would speak to Cranmer. Whether he actually slept, or whether this was simply Henry's way of avoiding the finality of what was to come, we don't know. Word was sent to Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who was at his residence at Croydon, several miles from London. Cranmer immediately set out for Whitehall Palace, where Henry lay dying, but by the time he arrived, in the early hours of January 28th, the king could no longer speak. Henry was unconscious or semi-conscious, his breathing shallow and irregular, clearly in his final moments. Cranmer knelt by the bedside and took Henry's hand. He spoke to the dying king, telling him to give some sign that he trusted in Christ for his salvation. According to Cranmer's later account, Henry, though unable to speak, squeezed the archbishop's hand with as much force as he could muster. It was his final communication, his last act, a silent affirmation of faith from a man who had broken with Rome, who had dissolved the monasteries, who had executed 2 of his wives and countless others, but who still believed, in his own way, that he was a faithful Christian. Shortly after this, at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning on January 28, 1547, Henry VIII passed away. He was 55 years old. He had reigned for 37 years, longer than any English monarch since Edward III, and he had transformed his kingdom beyond recognition. But the story doesn't quite end there, because what happened to Henry's body after his passing is almost as bizarre as the manner of his decline and demise. According to his will, Henry had requested that he be buried at Windsor Castle, in St. George's Chapel, in a tomb next to Jane Seymour, the wife who had given him his son and who had died before the relationship could sour. He had actually planned an elaborate tomb for himself, designed by an Italian sculptor, and had spent years collecting materials for it. The tomb was to be a magnificent monument, covered in black marble and gilt bronze, topped with a life-size effigy of the king in his prime. But this tomb was never completed. The money ran out, or perhaps the political will to complete such a grandiose monument faded after Henry's passing, and the elaborate plans were abandoned. In the end, Henry would be buried in a much simpler grave, though even this burial would be marked by strange and disturbing events. Henry's body was prepared for burial according to the customs of the time. It was embalmed, or at least an attempt was made to embalm it, though the techniques of 16th century embalming were crude and not always effective, especially for a body in Henry's condition. The body was wrapped in cerecloth, a waxed cloth, and placed in a lead coffin, which was then placed inside a wooden coffin. The coffin was placed in the presence chamber at Whitehall, where it lay in state for several days, surrounded by candles and guarded by members of the royal household. Then, on February 14th, the funeral procession set out from Westminster to Windsor. It was an elaborate affair, with hundreds of mourners, torchbearers, and members of the nobility, all proceeding at a slow, solemn pace toward the castle where Henry would be laid to rest. The coffin was transported on a specially constructed hearse, a large wheeled platform draped in black and gold cloth, topped with a wax effigy of the king dressed in his robes of state. The procession stopped overnight at Sion Abbey, a former monastery that Henry had dissolved and that now belonged to the crown. The coffin was placed in the chapel for the night, and guards were set to watch over it. But something went wrong during the night. According to several contemporary accounts, the lead coffin, which had been sealed, somehow burst open during the night. Whether this was due to gases produced by the decomposing body, or to poor craftsmanship in the sealing of the coffin, or to some other cause, is unclear. But the result was that Henry's body, or at least bodily fluids from the corpse, leaked out onto the floor of the chapel. In the morning, when the guards checked on the coffin, they found the mess, and they also found that dogs from the abbey had somehow gotten into the chapel and had licked up the fluids. This gruesome detail was recorded by several sources, and it was seen at the time as a kind of poetic justice, or perhaps divine judgment. There was a prophecy attributed to a friar named William Petto who had opposed Henry's break with Rome that had predicted that dogs would lick Henry's blood, just as dogs had licked the blood of the wicked King Ahab in the Bible. Whether the prophecy came before or after the event is unclear. Prophecies have a way of being created or modified after the fact, but the story was widely told and widely believed. After this disturbing incident, the coffin was resealed as best as possible, and the procession continued to Windsor, where Henry was finally buried next to Jane Seymour in the choir of St. George's Chapel. The burial service was held on February 16th, and then Henry's courtiers and nobles returned to London to begin the reign of his son, now King Edward VI. Henry's tomb, or rather his burial place, remained unmarked for centuries. The elaborate monument he had planned was never built, and he lay in an unmarked vault in the floor of the chapel. It wasn't until the 19th century that the location of his grave was definitively identified and marked with a simple stone slab in the floor. Today, visitors to St. George's Chapel can see the marker, a plain black stone with Henry's name and dates inscribed on it, lying in the floor of the choir. It's a remarkably modest memorial for one of England's most powerful and memorable monarchs, a man who once commanded absolute authority and who reshaped his nation according to his will. The immediate aftermath of Henry's passing was carefully managed by those who had been closest to him in his final years. His passing was kept secret for 3 days while the Privy Council made arrangements for the transition of power. This secrecy was not unusual for the time. It gave the government time to secure the realm and ensure that there would be no immediate challenges to the succession. During these 3 days, the courtiers who knew the truth went about their business as if nothing had happened, maintaining the elaborate fiction that the king was simply resting in his private chambers. Guards continued to stand at attention outside his rooms. Meals were delivered as usual, and anyone who asked after the king's health was given vague reassurances. Meanwhile, in secret meetings, the privy councillors made their plans. Edward Seymour moved quickly to consolidate power, arranging to have Prince Edward brought from Hertford, where he had been living, to London. Seymour also moved to secure the Treasury and the Tower of London, the fortress that controlled access to the city and that held the royal armory. By the time Henry's passing was publicly announced, Seymour had positioned himself to take control of the Regency government. When the announcement was finally made on January 31st, the news was received with mixed emotions throughout England. Some mourned the passing of a king who had ruled for nearly 4 decades, who had been the only monarch many English people had ever known. Church bells tolled across the country, and people wore black armbands or black clothing as signs of mourning. Official proclamations required all subjects to mourn the passing of their sovereign lord and to pray for his soul. Sermons were preached in churches across the land, eulogizing Henry's accomplishments, his strength, his wisdom, and his service to God and country. These official expressions of grief followed long-established protocols for royal mourning, but they tell us little about what people really felt. Some people, particularly those who had lost family members to Henry's paranoia and cruelty, probably breathed a sigh of relief. The families of executed courtiers, the monks and nuns who had been turned out of their monasteries, the Catholics who had been persecuted for their faith, the Protestants who had been burned for heresy, all of these people and their friends and relatives had reason to be glad that Henry was gone. But they could not express such feelings openly, because to speak ill of the dead king could still be dangerous. And many simply worried about what would come next, about whether the young Edward VI would be able to hold the kingdom together, or whether England would descend into the kind of chaos that had plagued it during the Wars of the Roses. The fear of civil war was very real. England had experienced such warfare within living memory, and everyone knew how devastating it could be. The Wars of the Roses had seen bloody battles, attainders and executions of nobles, the displacement of entire families, and economic devastation. Henry had brought stability, however brutal, and there was genuine concern about whether that stability would survive his passing. Some people hoarded food and supplies, anticipating possible disruption. Some noble families began quietly arming their retainers, preparing for possible conflict. Merchants and traders worried about whether contracts would be honored, whether debts would be paid, whether the currency would remain stable. These were uncertain times, and uncertainty breeds anxiety. Edward VI was just 9 years old when he became king, far too young to rule in his own right. Henry had anticipated this, and had made elaborate arrangements in his will for a regency council to govern until Edward came of age. But Henry's plans quickly fell apart. Within weeks of his passing, Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset and the young king's maternal uncle, had maneuvered himself into the position of Lord Protector, effectively ruling England in Edward's name. Somerset was a committed Protestant reformer, and under his guidance, England moved sharply in a Protestant direction, far beyond anything Henry had envisioned. The Latin Mass was abolished and replaced with an English prayer book. Images and shrines were removed from churches, and the clergy were allowed to marry. These reforms delighted Protestants but horrified Catholics, and they laid the groundwork for the religious conflicts that would dominate English politics for the next century. These reforms delighted Protestants but horrified Catholics, and they laid the groundwork for the religious conflicts that would dominate English politics for the next century. Many ordinary people, particularly in more conservative areas like the north and west of England, remained Catholic in their sympathies and resented the changes being imposed from London. There were scattered protests and minor uprisings, most notably the Prayer Book Rebellion in Devon and Cornwall in 1549, where thousands of people rose up demanding the restoration of the Latin Mass and traditional practices. Somerset responded with military force, sending an army that crushed the rebellion and executed its leaders. The message was clear. The Protestant reforms would be enforced regardless of popular sentiment, and resistance would be met with violence. The religious changes were accompanied by social and economic disruption. Enclosures of common land by wealthy landowners sparked Kett's Rebellion in Norfolk in 1549, another popular uprising that was brutally suppressed. Somerset's rule, which had begun with high hopes and reformist ideals, was increasingly seen as ineffective and chaotic. His colleagues on the council began to plot against him, and in October 1549 he was overthrown in a coup led by John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, later Duke of Northumberland. Somerset was imprisoned, and though initially spared, he was eventually executed in 1552 on trumped-up charges of treason. Northumberland continued Somerset's Protestant policies, but governed more effectively, bringing stability to the country and managing the young king's finances more responsibly. Edward VI himself was growing into an intelligent and committed Protestant, educated by tutors who imbued him with Reformed theology and a sense of his duty to establish a godly commonwealth in England. He took an active interest in religious matters and supported the continuing reforms. But tragically for England and for the Protestant cause, Edward was not healthy. He had always been a sickly child, prone to colds and fevers, and in early 1553 he fell seriously ill, probably with tuberculosis, though some historians have suggested other possibilities, including pneumonia or a congenital weakness of the lungs. Tuberculosis, known in the period as consumption or the White Plague, was a common killer in the 16th century. It attacked the lungs, causing progressive difficulty breathing, coughing up blood, fever, night sweats, and eventually death by suffocation as the lungs filled with fluid and scar tissue. There was no cure, and even wealthy patients with access to the best medical care had little chance of recovery once the disease had taken hold. Edward lingered for several months, growing steadily weaker, his breathing more labored, his coughing more severe. He was moved to Greenwich Palace, where the air was thought to be healthier, but it made no difference. The physicians tried every remedy they knew: bloodletting, purges, herbal concoctions, prayers, but nothing helped. By June 1553, it was clear that the king was dying, and this created a crisis for Northumberland and the Protestant faction. If Edward died, the succession would pass according to Henry VIII's will to Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, who was known to be a devout Catholic. Mary would certainly reverse the Protestant reforms, might punish those who had implemented them, and would probably align England with Catholic powers like Spain. For Northumberland and his allies, this was an unacceptable outcome, both religiously and personally, since they feared for their lives and fortunes under a Catholic queen. So they hatched a desperate plan to alter the succession. Edward, who shared their fears about a Catholic succession, was persuaded to set aside his father's will and to name as his heir Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant cousin who was descended from Henry VIII through his daughter Mary Tudor. Jane was married to Northumberland's son Guildford Dudley in a hasty wedding designed to tie her more closely to Northumberland's family. A document called the Demise for the Succession was drawn up, signed by Edward, and presented to the council and to leading nobles and judges, some of whom signed it reluctantly under pressure. On July 6, 1553, Edward VI passed away at Greenwich Palace at the age of just 15. He had reigned for only 6 years, and in that short time he had overseen a transformation of English religion that would have lasting consequences. His final words were reportedly a prayer: "O Lord God, save thy chosen people of England. O my Lord God, defend this realm from papistry and maintain thy true religion." It was the prayer of a young man who had been raised to believe that he was God's instrument for reforming England, and who faced death fearing that his work would be undone. He lingered for several months, but on July 6, 1553, he passed away at the age of just 15. His passing threw England into a succession crisis. Edward, influenced by his Protestant advisors, had tried to alter the succession to prevent his Catholic half-sister Mary from taking the throne, naming instead Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant cousin, as his heir. Jane Grey was a great-granddaughter of Henry VIII, descended through his younger daughter Mary Tudor, who had briefly been Queen of France. She was intelligent, well-educated, and deeply Protestant, but she had little political experience and no desire to be queen. When Edward's passing was announced, and she was informed that she had been named as his successor, she reportedly fainted from shock and later protested that the crown was not rightfully hers. But Northumberland and the Protestant faction insisted, and on July 10, 1553, Jane was proclaimed queen in London. Northumberland moved quickly to secure his position, sending forces to capture Mary, who had been living quietly at her estates in East Anglia. But Mary, forewarned of the plot, had already fled and had begun raising support. But this plan quickly collapsed. Mary had widespread support, both from Catholics who wanted to see the old religion restored and from those who simply believed in the legitimate line of succession. The principle of hereditary succession was deeply ingrained in English political culture, and many people, even some Protestants, felt that it was wrong to set aside Henry VIII's legitimate daughter in favor of a more distant relative simply because of religious differences. Mary was Henry's daughter, the rightful heir according to his will, and she had done nothing to forfeit her claim. As Mary moved through East Anglia, nobles and gentry flocked to her banner, bringing their armed retainers with them. The common people also supported her, not necessarily because they wanted Catholicism restored, but because they believed she was the legitimate queen. Within days, Mary had an army of thousands, while Northumberland's support in London crumbled. The council that had supported Jane's proclamation began to have second thoughts. Some members secretly communicated with Mary, and the city militia showed no enthusiasm for fighting against the rightful heir. Jane Grey reigned for just 9 days before Mary triumphantly entered London and claimed her throne. On July 19, 1553, the council that had proclaimed Jane now proclaimed Mary instead, and Jane, who had never wanted to be queen, was imprisoned in the Tower of London along with her husband and Northumberland. It had been a brief and futile attempt to prevent the legitimate succession, and it collapsed because it had no popular support. Mary entered London on August 3rd to cheering crowds, her victory complete. She showed initial mercy to the conspirators. Northumberland was executed for treason, but Jane Grey and her husband were initially spared, imprisoned but allowed to live. Mary hoped that by showing clemency, she could begin her reign on a positive note and could unite her subjects. But this mercy would not last. Jane Grey, innocent pawn in the power games of her elders, would be executed the following year, in February 1554, one of the many victims of Tudor succession politics. She was just 16 or 17 years old when she was beheaded on Tower Green, and she went to her passing with dignity and courage, a tragic figure caught up in events beyond her control. Mary I, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, would reign for just 5 years, from 1553 to 1558. She was determined to restore Catholicism to England, and she pursued this goal with a zeal that earned her the nickname Bloody Mary. Mary genuinely believed that she had a divine mission to bring England back to the true faith, to undo the schism that her father had created, and to restore communion with Rome. She began by reversing the Protestant legislation of Edward's reign, restoring the Latin Mass, bringing back the bishops who had been deposed for refusing to accept Protestant reforms, and reconciling England with the papacy. In November 1554, Cardinal Reginald Pole, the son of Margaret Pole, whom Henry VIII had executed, returned to England as papal legate and formally absolved the nation of the sin of schism. It was an emotional moment for Mary, who had endured years of humiliation and danger during her father's reign, and who now saw her mother's faith vindicated and restored. But Mary went further than simple restoration of Catholic worship. She revived the heresy laws that allowed the Church to prosecute those who held heretical beliefs, and she began a campaign of persecution against Protestants who refused to conform. Hundreds of Protestants were burned at the stake during her reign, including Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, the man who had held Henry's hand as he was passing away, along with Bishops Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, and many ordinary men and women whose only crime was refusing to accept Catholic doctrine. The burnings took place in towns and cities across England, public spectacles intended to intimidate the population and to demonstrate the consequences of heresy. But they had the opposite effect. Instead of terrifying people into conformity, the burnings created martyrs whose stories would be told and retold by Protestant propagandists. John Foxe's Acts and Monuments, better known as Foxe's Book of Martyrs, would chronicle these executions in vivid and horrifying detail, complete with woodcut illustrations showing the martyrs burning at the stake, and would become one of the most influential books in English Protestant culture. The image of Protestant martyrs dying bravely for their faith while Catholic authorities looked on with approval became a powerful part of English national identity and contributed to a lasting anti-Catholic sentiment in English culture. Mary also made the deeply unpopular decision to marry Philip II of Spain, which many English people saw as subordinating England to Spanish interests. Philip was the son of the Holy Roman Empire Charles V, Mary's cousin and the most powerful monarch in Europe. The marriage made political sense from Mary's perspective. It allied England with the greatest Catholic power and provided her with a powerful husband who could help her govern and defend the realm. But the English people saw it differently.
They feared that England would become merely a province of the Spanish Empire, that English resources would be drained to support Spanish wars, and that Spanish customs and Spanish officials would be imposed on them. There was considerable opposition to the marriage, including Wyatt's rebellion in early 1554, an uprising that aimed to prevent the marriage and possibly to replace Mary with her Protestant sister Elizabeth. The rebellion was suppressed, and its leaders, including Sir Thomas Wyatt, were executed, but it showed the depth of popular feeling against the Spanish match. The marriage itself, celebrated in July 1554 at Winchester Cathedral, was not a happy one. Philip was 11 years younger than Mary, and he had little affection for his older wife, though he treated her with courtesy. Mary, however, fell deeply in love with her husband, and this made her situation all the more tragic. She desperately wanted to have a child, to produce a Catholic heir who would continue her religious restoration, and who would ensure that her sister Elizabeth, a Protestant, would never become queen. In 1554, Mary believed she was pregnant. Her belly swelled, she felt movements, and preparations were made for the birth. But no child came. What Mary had experienced was a phantom pregnancy, probably caused by a combination of her desperate desire for a child, her age, she was 38, and possibly some medical condition, such as a tumor. It must have been devastating for Mary when she finally had to accept that there was no child, that her body had deceived her, and that her hopes for a Catholic heir had been false. She experienced another phantom pregnancy in 1557 with the same result, and by then she must have known that she would never have children. She desperately wanted to have a child, to produce a Catholic heir who would continue her religious restoration, but she suffered at least 2 phantom pregnancies, and no child ever came. She passed away, probably from ovarian cancer, in November 1558, broken-hearted and largely unloved by her subjects. Her final months were marked by illness, depression, and the knowledge that her sister Elizabeth, a Protestant, would succeed her and would undo all her work. She suffered from severe abdominal pain, probably from the cancer that was killing her, and she experienced fever, weakness, and weight loss. She knew she was dying, and she knew that with her passing, the Catholic restoration would end. In her final days, she was attended by her ladies and by Cardinal Pole, who tried to comfort her with prayers and assurances that she had done God's work. She died on November 17, 1558, at St. James's Palace in London, just a few hours before Cardinal Pole himself passed away. It was as if the Catholic cause in England died with them. She was buried at Westminster Abbey, and though her tomb is magnificent, shared with her sister Elizabeth, who would be buried beside her decades later, her reputation was ruined. The burnings, the Spanish marriage, the phantom pregnancies, the failure to produce an heir, all of these combined to make her one of the least popular monarchs in English history. The nickname Bloody Mary would stick, and she would be remembered primarily for religious persecution rather than for her genuine piety and her sincere belief that she was serving God. With her passing, the crown passed to Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, the last of Henry VIII's children. Elizabeth I would prove to be the greatest of the Tudors, reigning for 45 years and guiding England through one of its most successful periods. She re-established Protestantism, but in a more moderate form than Edward's reign, creating what became known as the Elizabethan religious settlement, a middle way between Catholic and Protestant extremes that most English people could accept.
This settlement was embodied in the Act of Supremacy of 1559, which re-established the monarch as supreme governor of the Church of England, and the Act of Uniformity, which required the use of an English prayer book based on Cranmer's work but modified to be more acceptable to conservative worshippers. Elizabeth's religious policy was guided by pragmatism rather than theological zeal. She reportedly said that she had no desire to make windows into men's souls, meaning that she cared more about outward conformity than inner belief. Catholics who attended Church of England services and kept their true beliefs private were generally left alone, though Catholic priests who actively worked to convert people or who plotted against the Queen were prosecuted. Protestants who wanted more radical reforms, the Puritans, as they came to be called, were frustrated by Elizabeth's conservatism, but were generally tolerated as long as they didn't challenge her authority too directly. Elizabeth faced numerous challenges during her long reign, including threats from Catholic powers abroad who saw her as illegitimate and heretical, plots and conspiracies from Catholics at home who wanted to replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots, and the constant pressure to marry and produce an heir. She handled all of these with remarkable political skill. When Pope Pius V excommunicated her in 1570 and declared that Catholics were released from their allegiance to her, she responded by tightening laws against Catholics while continuing to insist that she persecuted them for treason, not for religion. When Mary, Queen of Scots, her Catholic cousin, fled to England and became the focus of Catholic plots, Elizabeth kept her imprisoned for 19 years before finally, reluctantly, signing the warrant for her execution in 1587. When Philip II of Spain, frustrated by English support for Dutch rebels and English piracy against Spanish shipping, launched the Great Armada in 1588, a massive fleet intended to invade England and restore Catholicism by force, Elizabeth rallied her people with stirring speeches, and her navy, aided by bad weather, scattered and destroyed the Spanish fleet. She defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588, establishing England as a major naval power. The defeat of the Armada was a turning point in English history and in European power politics. It demonstrated that Spain was not invincible. It established England as a major naval power, and it secured the Protestant settlement in England. Elizabeth herself traveled to Tilbury, where English forces were assembled to repel a possible Spanish landing, and delivered one of the most famous speeches in English history, declaring, "I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." The speech, whether she actually spoke exactly these words, or whether they were embellished by later accounts, captured Elizabeth's ability to use her status as a woman to her advantage, turning what could have been seen as a weakness into a strength by contrasting her supposedly weak female body with her strong, kingly spirit. The Elizabethan age saw an explosion of literary and artistic achievement that would define English culture for centuries. William Shakespeare, born in 1564, wrote his plays and sonnets during Elizabeth's reign, creating works that explored the full range of human experience and that continue to be performed and studied worldwide. Christopher Marlowe, Thomas Kidd, Ben Jonson, and other playwrights created a vibrant theatrical culture centered in London. Edmund Spenser wrote The Faerie Queene, an elaborate allegorical poem celebrating Elizabeth as Gloriana, the Faerie Queen. Sir Philip Sidney wrote poetry and prose that embodied Renaissance ideals of courtly culture. English music flourished with composers like William Byrd and Thomas Tallis, who wrote both sacred and secular music of great beauty.
English explorers like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh sailed to the Americas, claiming new territories and bringing back wealth and exotic goods. The English language itself was expanding and evolving, incorporating new words and developing a flexibility and richness that would make it one of the world's great literary languages. Elizabeth encouraged this cultural flourishing. She attended plays, supported musicians and poets, and understood the power of culture to enhance national prestige and identity. Her court was a center of learning and sophistication, where scholars, artists, and intellectuals gathered, and where new ideas were discussed and debated. She herself was highly educated, fluent in Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, and she took pleasure in intellectual conversation and debate. She used patronage strategically, rewarding those who served her well with positions, honors, and grants, and creating a system where talent and ability could lead to advancement regardless of birth. This was very much in the pattern established by her father, Henry VIII, who had also used patronage to build a court culture that was both magnificent and competitive, where ambitious men vied for royal favor and where service to the crown could lead to wealth and power. And she did all this while remaining unmarried, the Virgin Queen, using the possibility of marriage as a diplomatic tool, but never actually committing to any suitor. She consciously presented herself as the opposite of her father in many ways. Where Henry had been impulsive and violent, Elizabeth was calculating and subtle. Where Henry had gone through 6 wives, Elizabeth remained single. Where Henry had been profligate with money, Elizabeth was careful and economical. But in other ways, Elizabeth was very much her father's daughter. She had Henry's intelligence, his political instincts, his ability to command loyalty and respect. She had his vanity and his concern with image and display. She had his temper, though she learned to control it better than he ever did. And she had his absolute determination to be the supreme authority in her realm, to allow no rival power, whether foreign or domestic, secular or religious, to challenge her authority. When Elizabeth passed away in 1603, after 45 years on the throne, she left England stronger, richer, and more united than it had been at any time since before Henry VIII began his religious revolution. The Tudor dynasty died with her. She had no children, and the crown passed to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland for the first time. But the religious settlement that Elizabeth had established, building on the foundations laid by her father, would endure, and the Church of England that Henry had created in his quest for a male heir would become a permanent feature of English life. So what, in the end, do we make of Henry VIII and his bizarre passing? How do we evaluate this complex, contradictory figure who changed the course of English history? On one hand, Henry was undoubtedly a monster. He executed 2 of his 6 wives, along with countless advisors, courtiers, and subjects who had the misfortune to cross him or to be caught up in his paranoia. He dissolved hundreds of monasteries and convents, destroying centuries of religious and cultural heritage and leaving thousands of monks, nuns, and lay brothers without homes or livelihoods. He presided over religious persecutions that saw both Catholics and Protestants burned, hanged, or beheaded for their beliefs. He was vain, cruel, paranoid, and in his later years he was a physical wreck whose personality had been warped by pain, disease, and absolute power. The Golden Prince of 1509 had become a tyrant whose own courtiers lived in fear of his unpredictable rages.
But on the other hand, Henry was also a transformative figure who shaped the modern world in ways that are still felt today. He broke the power of the Catholic Church in England, ending centuries of papal authority and creating the conditions for the development of Protestantism in Britain. He strengthened the power of Parliament, using it as a tool to legitimize his religious reforms, and in the process, making it an essential part of English government. He expanded the Royal Navy, laying the foundations for England's later maritime supremacy. He encouraged Renaissance learning and culture, and his court was a center of art, music, and intellectual life. He was, for most of his reign, an effective and capable ruler who kept England at peace, who managed the complex diplomatic relationships with France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire, and who left his kingdom, despite all the turmoil, fundamentally stronger than he found it. The tragedy of Henry VIII is that he could have been so much more than he was. If he had died in 1536, after the jousting accident, but before the execution of Anne Boleyn, he would probably be remembered as one of England's greatest kings. But the 15 years that followed, the years of increasing paranoia, cruelty, and physical decline, tarnished his reputation beyond repair. The question of what caused Henry's transformation from Golden Prince to bloated tyrant has fascinated historians and medical professionals for centuries. Was it simply the corruption that comes with absolute power, the truth of Lord Acton's famous dictum that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely? Was it the cumulative psychological effect of his marital troubles, his desperate quest for a male heir, and the stresses of his religious revolution? Was it the physical pain from his ulcers and other ailments that warped his personality and made him lash out at those around him? Was it brain damage from the 1536 jousting accident? Was it some undiagnosed medical condition like diabetes or Cushing syndrome that affected both his body and his mind? Or was it simply that the flaws that had always been present in his character, the vanity, the self-centeredness, the conviction of his own rightness, were allowed to flourish unchecked because there was no one with the power to restrain him? The truth is probably some combination of all these factors, each reinforcing the others in a downward spiral that ended with the diseased, paranoid tyrant who passed away at Whitehall Palace in the early hours of that January morning. What is certain is that Henry's physical decline in his final years was both a cause and a symptom of his broader deterioration. The leg ulcers, the obesity, the inability to move or exercise, the constant pain, all of these things would have had profound effects on his mental state and his ability to govern effectively. Modern medicine recognizes the strong connection between physical pain and mental health, between chronic illness and depression, anxiety, and changes in personality. Henry had no access to effective pain management, no antibiotics to treat his infections, no way to lose weight safely, or to treat his circulatory problems. His health began to decline, leaving him in a weakening body while surrounded by physicians who, despite their efforts, could not fully understand his condition or provide an effective treatment. Is it any wonder that he became increasingly difficult, increasingly suspicious, increasingly prone to lashing out at those around him? The remarkable thing, perhaps, is not that he became a tyrant, but that he remained as mentally sharp and politically astute as he did for as long as he did. The bizarre circumstances of Henry's final days and passing, from the delicate political dance around telling him he was dying, to the grotesque incident with the burst coffin and the dogs at Sion Abbey, to the unmarked grave that would be his resting place for centuries, all of these details seem almost too strange to be true, like something from a Gothic horror story rather than sober history. But they are well documented in contemporary sources, and they tell us something important about the nature of power and mortality. Henry had spent his entire reign trying to control everything: his kingdom, his church, his succession, his own image and legacy. But in the end, he couldn't control his own body. He couldn't prevent the slow, painful decline that turned him from an athlete into an invalid. He couldn't prevent the infections that poisoned his blood and caused him excruciating pain. And after his passing, he couldn't control what happened to his corpse, couldn't prevent the grotesque indignity of his body bursting open and being defiled by dogs. It's a powerful reminder that no matter how much power a person accumulates in life, no matter how many subjects they rule, or how much they reshape the world according to their will, in the end, they are still mortal, still subject to the same biological processes and ultimate fate as the humblest of their subjects. There's also something almost Shakespearean about Henry's story: the rise and fall, the transformation from beloved prince to feared tyrant, the tragic flaws that lead to self-destruction, the sense that the protagonist brings about his own downfall through his own choices and character defects. Shakespeare himself, of course, never wrote a play about Henry VIII, or at least not one that dealt honestly with his reign. The play, titled Henry VIII, that is attributed to Shakespeare, probably written in collaboration with John Fletcher, is a cautious, sanitized account that ends with the birth of Elizabeth I and says nothing about the darkness of Henry's later years. This is not surprising. Shakespeare was writing during Elizabeth's reign, and it would have been extraordinarily dangerous to portray her father as the monster he became. But later writers and historians have not been so constrained, and Henry has been the subject of countless biographies, novels, plays, and films, each trying to understand and explain this complex, fascinating, troubling figure. In popular culture, Henry VIII has become something of a caricature: the fat king with 6 wives who created the Church of England so he could get divorced. This image, while not entirely inaccurate, misses the complexity of the man and the significance of his reign. Henry was not just a wife-killer. He was a Renaissance prince, a patron of the arts, a theological scholar, a skilled politician, and a man who genuinely believed he was doing God's will. His quest for a male heir was not just personal vanity. It was driven by a genuine and well-founded fear that without a male successor, England would descend into civil war. His break with Rome was not just about his desire to marry Anne Boleyn. It was part of a broader European movement of religious reform and national self-assertion. His cruelty and paranoia, while inexcusable, were not unusual for monarchs of his time. Indeed, by the standards of 16th-century statecraft, Henry was sometimes almost restrained. What made Henry different was not that he was cruel, but that he had the power and the political skill to reshape an entire kingdom according to his will, and that the consequences of his actions would echo through centuries. The medical mystery of Henry's decline continues to fascinate modern researchers. In recent years, there have been several attempts to diagnose Henry's conditions using modern medical knowledge. Some researchers have focused on the leg ulcers, suggesting that they may have been caused by a condition called chronic osteomyelitis, a bone infection that can result from injuries and that would have been extremely difficult to treat in the 16th century. Others have focused on his metabolic and hormonal symptoms, suggesting conditions like type 2 diabetes, Cushing syndrome, or even a rare genetic condition called McLeod syndrome, which can cause personality changes, muscle wasting, and heart problems. Still others have focused on the possible brain injury from the jousting accident, using what we now know about traumatic brain injury and chronic traumatic encephalopathy to understand the personality changes that Henry exhibited in his later years. The truth is that without being able to examine Henry himself, or at least to examine tissue samples from his body, we can never know for certain what was wrong with him. But these medical detective stories tell us something about our continuing fascination with Henry, our desire to understand not just what he did, but why he did it, what drove this transformation from hero to villain. One of the most poignant aspects of Henry's story is the fate of his children, the 3 legitimate children who survived him, and who each in turn wore the crown. Edward VI, the long-awaited son, the boy for whom Henry had broken with Rome and executed 2 wives, reigned for just 6 years and died before reaching adulthood, never marrying and never having children. Mary I, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, reigned for 5 years and spent that time trying desperately to undo her father's work and restore Catholicism, only to fail and to die childless and embittered. Elizabeth I, Anne Boleyn's daughter, the child whose birth had disappointed Henry so much, would become the greatest of the Tudors, but she too would remain childless, and with her passing, the Tudor line that Henry had been so desperate to secure would end. It's a kind of cosmic irony that the dynasty Henry had obsessed over, that he had torn apart his kingdom to preserve, would end just 2 generations after his passing, and that his greatest legacy would come not from his son, but from the daughter he had been so disappointed to receive. Another fascinating aspect of Henry's legacy is the way he transformed the physical landscape of England. The dissolution of the monasteries, carried out between 1536 and 1541, was one of the most dramatic events in English history. Over 800 monasteries, priories, convents, and friaries were closed, their residents dispersed, and their wealth confiscated by the crown. The buildings themselves were often stripped of their valuable materials, the lead from the roofs, the stones from the walls, the precious metals from the altars, and what remained was left to decay. Today, the ruins of these monasteries dot the English countryside, romantic ruins covered in ivy, popular tourist destinations, but also reminders of a vast cultural and religious heritage that was deliberately destroyed. Henry used the wealth from the dissolved monasteries to fund his wars, to build new palaces, and to reward his supporters with grants of former monastic lands. This redistribution of property created a new class of landowners who had a vested interest in supporting the religious changes, because if Catholicism was restored, they might have to give back the lands they had acquired. In this way, Henry's religious revolution became entrenched not just through law and theology, but through economics, through the self-interest of thousands of families who had benefited from the spoils of the dissolution. Henry also left a legacy in the form of the magnificent palaces he built. Hampton Court Palace, Whitehall Palace, Nonsuch Palace, and others were among the largest and most splendid royal residences in Europe. He spent enormous sums on these buildings, creating settings that would impress foreign visitors and assert his power and magnificence. Hampton Court, which Henry acquired from Cardinal Wolsey in 1529, was extensively remodeled and expanded to become one of the grandest palaces in England. Henry added new apartments, a great hall with a magnificent hammer-beam roof, elaborate kitchens capable of feeding hundreds of people, tennis courts, tillyard for jousting, and extensive gardens. The palace was designed to accommodate the elaborate ceremonial and hospitality that were essential to royal power, with separate apartments for the king and queen, rooms for courtiers and visitors, and spaces for entertainment and display. Whitehall Palace in London was even larger, covering 23 acres and containing over 1,500 rooms, making it the largest palace in Europe at the time. Henry built a tillyard, tennis courts, a cockpit for watching cockfighting, bowling alleys, and extensive gardens. The palace was the center of government as well as the royal residence, containing offices for ministers and meeting rooms for the council. None such palace in Surrey was perhaps the most ambitious of Henry's building projects, begun in 1538 and intended to surpass any palace in Europe in magnificence. The name itself proclaimed this ambition. There would be no such place like it anywhere. The palace was decorated with elaborate stucco work, gilding and carvings, with fantastic designs combining classical, Gothic, and modern elements. It was a statement of Henry's wealth, power, and cultural sophistication, designed to impress foreign visitors and to demonstrate that England could match the grandeur of France or the Holy Roman Empire. Most of these palaces are gone now. Whitehall burned down in the 17th century, with only the banqueting house surviving. None such was demolished in the 18th century after being sold to pay debts, and St. James's Palace, another Henry VIII construction, survives but in much altered form. But Hampton Court survives and gives us a sense of the grandeur with which Henry surrounded himself. Walking through Hampton Court today, with its great hall, its elaborate kitchens, its gardens and tennis courts, you can get a sense of what it must have been like to live and work in Henry's court, the splendor and the spectacle, but also the undercurrent of fear, knowing that the magnificent king who presided over all this was also a man who could, on a whim, send you to the Tower and to the scaffold. The legacy of Henry VIII extends far beyond England's borders. His break with Rome was part of the broader European Reformation, the religious revolution that split Western Christianity, and that would lead to centuries of religious conflict. Henry himself was not really a Protestant in the theological sense. He remained conservative on most points of doctrine, and he persecuted radical Protestants as harshly as he persecuted Catholics who refused to accept his supremacy. The 6 Articles of 1539, sometimes called the Whip with 6 strings, affirmed traditional Catholic doctrines, including transubstantiation, clerical celibacy, and the necessity of auricular confession, and prescribed harsh penalties, including burning at the stake for those who denied these doctrines. Henry saw himself as a Catholic, just not a Roman Catholic. He believed in most Catholic teachings, but rejected papal authority over the English Church. This position was theologically and politically complex, and it satisfied neither committed Catholics nor committed Protestants, but it reflected Henry's genuine beliefs and his desire to control religious policy according to his own understanding. But by breaking with Rome and by authorizing an English translation of the Bible, he opened the door for Protestant ideas to spread in England. The Great Bible, published in 1539 under Thomas Cromwell's direction, was the first authorized English translation, and copies were required to be placed in every parish church where people could read them. This was revolutionary. For centuries, the Bible had been available only in Latin, accessible only to the clergy and to educated elites. Now ordinary English men and women could read Scripture for themselves, could interpret it according to their own understanding, and could compare what they read with what they were taught by the Church. This inevitably led to questions, challenges, and the spread of reformist ideas. Even though Henry tried to control how the Bible was interpreted, publishing it in English created forces that he could not fully control. During the reign of Edward VI, England became a genuinely Protestant nation, and although Mary I tried to reverse this, Elizabeth I would re-establish Protestantism in a form that would become the Church of England. This church, Anglican or Episcopal as it's known in various parts of the world, would go on to become one of the major branches of Christianity, with millions of adherents around the globe today, in England, the United States, Canada, Australia, many African nations, and elsewhere. All of this can be traced back to Henry's desire for a male heir and his inability to accept that the Pope would not grant him what he wanted. The Church of England that emerged from Henry's break with Rome developed its own distinctive character, neither fully Protestant nor fully Catholic, but occupying a middle ground that came to be called the Via Media, or Middle Way. It retained bishops and a hierarchical structure unlike many Protestant churches. It maintained traditional liturgy and ceremony. It kept many Catholic practices that other Protestant churches rejected, but it also embraced Protestant principles like justification by faith and the authority of Scripture. This compromise was frustrating to purists on both sides. Catholics saw Anglicans as heretics who had broken with true Christianity, while radical Protestants saw the Church of England as insufficiently reformed, still too Catholic in its practices and structures. But this middle way proved remarkably durable and flexible. It allowed the Church of England to accommodate a wide range of beliefs and practices, and it created a religious culture that valued moderation and comprehensiveness over doctrinal purity. The worldwide Anglican Communion that exists today, with its 85 million members spread across 165 countries, is a direct descendant of the church that Henry VIII created, and its character still reflects the peculiar circumstances of its founding, a church born not from theological conviction but from political necessity, but which developed over time into a distinct and influential tradition within Christianity. All of this can be traced back to Henry's desire for a male heir and his inability to accept that the Pope would not grant him what he wanted. Henry's story also raises profound questions about the nature of power, about what happens when one person has absolute authority over the lives of millions, with no effective checks or balances. In Henry's England, the king's word was law. Parliament existed, but it met only when the king summoned it, and could pass only laws that the king supported. The courts administered justice, but the king could override their decisions. The church provided moral guidance, but the king was its supreme head. There was no free press, no opposition party, no independent judiciary that could restrain the monarch. If the king wanted someone executed, that person would be executed, regardless of guilt or innocence. If the king wanted to seize someone's property, he could do so. If the king wanted to change the religion of the entire nation, he could do that too. This kind of absolute power inevitably corrupts, inevitably leads to abuses, because there is nothing to stop a tyrant from following his worst impulses. The fact that Henry was, for most of his reign, a relatively effective and competent ruler does not change the fact that the system itself was fundamentally unjust, fundamentally vulnerable to abuse. The English people, or at least some of them,
recognized this even at the time.
There were several rebellions against Henry's religious policies, most notably the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, a popular uprising in the north of England that sought to reverse the dissolution of the monasteries and restore the old religion. This rebellion was massive in scale, involving perhaps 30,000 to 40,000 participants at its height, including nobles, clergy, and common people. It began in Lincolnshire in October 1536, sparked by rumors about the dissolution of parish churches and the confiscation of church goods. The rebellion quickly spread to Yorkshire and the northern counties, where it was joined by powerful northern lords like Lord Darcy and Sir Robert Constable. The rebels adopted religious symbols, carrying banners depicting the 5 wounds of Christ and wearing badges showing the same imagery. They drew up a list of demands that included the restoration of the monasteries, the removal of Thomas Cromwell and other reformist ministers, the legitimization of Princess Mary, and a return to traditional religious practices. Henry was genuinely alarmed by the scale of the rebellion. His military forces in the north were insufficient to confront such a large uprising, and he feared that if the rebels marched south, they might threaten his throne. So he employed a strategy of deception and delay. He sent the Duke of Norfolk, one of his most experienced military commanders, to negotiate with the rebels, but instructed Norfolk to promise anything necessary to get the rebels to disperse, with no intention of keeping those promises. Norfolk met with the rebel leaders at Doncaster and listened to their grievances with apparent sympathy. He promised that the king would consider their demands, that a parliament would be called in the north to address their concerns, and that there would be a general pardon for all those who had participated in the rebellion. The rebel leaders, believing these promises, agreed to disperse their forces and send representatives to London to negotiate further. It was a fatal mistake. Once the rebel army had dispersed, Henry showed his true colors. He declared that the promises made under duress were not binding, and he began a campaign of savage retribution against the rebellion's leaders and participants. Lord Darcy, Sir Robert Constable, and other leaders were arrested, tried for treason, and executed. Robert Aske, the charismatic lawyer who had been one of the main leaders of the rebellion, was hanged in chains at York, left to die slowly as a warning to others. Hundreds of ordinary participants were also executed, and Henry ordered that their bodies be displayed in prominent locations throughout the north as a warning. Monasteries that had been occupied by the rebels were immediately dissolved, their abbots arrested and executed if they had shown any sympathy to the rebellion. The message was clear. Henry would tolerate no challenge to his authority, no matter how popular or well organized. The Pilgrimage of Grace was the last major popular uprising of Henry's reign, but its brutal suppression left a legacy of fear and resentment in the north that would persist for generations. Henry initially negotiated with the rebels, making promises that he had no intention of keeping, and when they dispersed, he had the leaders hunted down and executed. Hundreds of people were put to passing for their part in the rebellion, and the north of England was terrorized into submission. It was a chilling demonstration of the ruthlessness with which Henry could suppress dissent when his authority was challenged. Other forms of resistance were more subtle: the refusal to attend the new church services, the hiding of Catholic priests, the secret practice of the old rites. But open resistance was too dangerous, and most people, whatever their private beliefs, outwardly conformed to the king's wishes. It was safer that way. As we reflect on Henry VIII and his bizarre passing, it's worth considering what lessons, if any, we can draw from his story for our own time. We live in a very different world from 16th century England. We have democratic governments with systems of checks and balances, we have human rights protections, we have free speech and a free press that can hold leaders accountable. But even in modern democracies, there are always people who seek absolute power, who resent any limitations on their authority, who see dissent as treason and opposition as betrayal. Henry's story is a cautionary tale about what happens when such people achieve their goals, about how power corrupts even well-intentioned people, and about how absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's also a reminder that physical health and mental health are connected, that chronic pain and illness can change personality and judgment, and that we should be cautious about giving too much power to individuals because we never know how they might change or what circumstances might affect their judgment. Another lesson from Henry's story is about the importance of institutional checks on power. Henry was able to do what he did because the institutions of his time, Parliament, the Church, the nobility, were not strong enough or independent enough to restrain him. When he wanted to break with Rome, Parliament passed the necessary legislation. When he wanted to execute his wives, the courts obliged. When he wanted to dissolve the monasteries, his commissioners carried out his orders. There was no institution with the authority to tell the king no, to refuse to carry out an unjust order, to protect the innocent from the monarch's wrath. In modern democracies, we take for granted the existence of independent institutions, an independent judiciary, a free press, a professional civil service that can resist unjust orders and protect individual rights. But these institutions are not self-sustaining. They require constant vigilance and defense, because there are always people who would like to weaken or co-opt them for their own purposes. Henry's reign shows us what happens when such institutions don't exist or are too weak to function effectively. Finally, Henry's story is a reminder of the importance of succession planning and the dangers of concentrating hopes and fears on a single individual or a single line of descent. Henry's desperate quest for a male heir caused immense suffering and reshaped an entire nation. Yet, in the end, it was his daughter, not his son, who would prove to be the greatest Tudor monarch. His obsession with securing the succession through a male heir blinded him to the possibility that a woman could rule effectively, and he went to extreme lengths to produce a son, when his daughter Elizabeth, whom he largely ignored and at times endangered, would turn out to be more than capable of wearing the crown. There's a broader lesson here about the dangers of rigid thinking, of being so convinced that there is only one acceptable solution to a problem that we cause enormous harm in pursuit of that solution, when alternative approaches might have been just as effective or even better. The story of Henry VIII's decline and bizarre passing is ultimately a very human story. It's the story of a man who started with every advantage: youth, health, intelligence, wealth, power, and who squandered those advantages through a combination of bad luck, bad decisions, and character flaws. It's the story of how physical decline can mirror and accelerate moral decline, how pain and illness can warp judgment and personality. It's the story of the corruption that comes with absolute power and the tragedy that comes when there are no effective checks on that power. It's the story of how obsession,
Whether it's an obsession with producing a male heir, or an obsession with being obeyed, or an obsession with one's own righteousness, can lead to terrible consequences. But it's also the story of a transformative figure, a man who, despite all his flaws and cruelties, changed the course of history and whose decisions still affect the world we live in today. When visitors today go to St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle and stand over the simple black stone that marks Henry's grave, they are standing over the remains of one of history's most complex and controversial figures. Beneath their feet lies the body of a man who was once the most handsome prince in Europe and who became a diseased, obese tyrant. A man who was a devoted Catholic in his youth and who broke with Rome in his maturity. A man who loved music, poetry, and theology, but who sent scholars and artists to their passings for disagreeing with him. A man who was capable of great charm and generosity, but also of cruelty and vindictiveness. A man who desperately wanted to be remembered as a great king and who achieved that goal, but not in the way he hoped or expected. As we've explored tonight, the passing of Henry VIII was not just a historical event. It was the culmination of years of physical and psychological decline, a decline that was as bizarre and disturbing as it was tragic. From the Golden Prince of 1509 to the dying tyrant of 1547, Henry's journey is one of the most dramatic transformations in history, and his final moments, surrounded by fearful courtiers who dared not even tell him he was dying, followed by the grotesque incident at Sion Abbey, seem almost like a judgment on a life lived without restraint or accountability. Yet, for all the darkness of Henry's final years and the bizarreness of his demise, we cannot simply dismiss him as a monster or a cautionary tale. He was also a capable ruler who strengthened England, a patron of the Renaissance who fostered learning and culture, and a man who, for all his faults, believed he was doing his duty to God and to his kingdom. The complexity of Henry VIII, the way he combined greatness and cruelty, vision and vindictiveness, intelligence and irrationality, is what makes him such a fascinating figure, and what ensures that, more than 470 years after his passing, we are still talking about him, still trying to understand him, still grappling with the legacy he left behind. His story reminds us that history is not made by simple heroes and villains, but by complex human beings with all their contradictions, that the same person can be capable of both great achievements and terrible crimes, and that understanding historical figures requires us to see them in their full complexity, neither excusing their crimes nor ignoring their accomplishments. The bizarre life and passing of Henry VIII continues to capture our imagination because it speaks to universal human experiences and fears. The fear of aging and physical decline, the fear of losing control over our own bodies and lives, the way that pain and illness can change us, the question of how we will be remembered after we're gone, all of these themes are present in Henry's story. We may not all be kings with the power to reshape nations, but we all face mortality. We all deal with the changes that age brings. We all wonder about our legacy. In that sense, Henry's story, for all its unique historical circumstances, is also deeply relatable. It's a story about what it means to be human, about the gap between our aspirations and our achievements, about the way that physical bodies impose limitations even on the most powerful among us, and about the fact that, in the end, death comes for everyone, regardless of rank or power or accomplishment.
The bizarre circumstances of Henry's final days and passing, from the inability of his courtiers to tell him the truth, to the bursting of his coffin and the desecration of his corpse by dogs, serve as a kind of leveling, a reminder that even the mightiest monarch is subject to the same biological processes and ultimate fate as everyone else. As we come to the end of our deep dive into this dark chapter of Tudor history, it's worth reflecting on what the story of Henry VIII and his bizarre passing tells us about power, about mortality, about the human condition. We've seen how a golden prince can become a bloated tyrant, how physical pain and illness can warp personality and judgment, how absolute power corrupts even intelligent and capable people, how obsession can lead to terrible consequences, and how, in the end, no amount of power or wealth can protect us from the ultimate reality of death. We've seen the human cost of Henry's choices, the wives executed, the advisors sent to the scaffold, the monasteries dissolved, the people burned or hanged for their religious beliefs. But we've also seen the historical significance of Henry's reign, how his break with Rome reshaped English religion and politics, how his children would go on to further transform the nation, how the consequences of his decisions still echo in our world today. Henry VIII was neither a simple hero nor a simple villain. He was a complex, flawed, fascinating human being who wielded enormous power, and who used that power in ways that were sometimes beneficial and sometimes destructive. His life and passing remind us of the importance of institutional checks on power, of the dangers of obsession and absolutism, of the connections between physical and mental health, and of the fundamental equality of all humans in the face of mortality, regardless of earthly rank or achievement. Thanks for watching this video. Good night.